Russians lose their minds over Belgorod. Ukraine keeps trolling, using language that echoes Kremlin lines used in previous Russian incursions into Ukrainian territory. Kyiv's officials appear to be enjoying themselves as the pro-Ukraine incursion into the Belgorod region continues into its second day. Russian propagandists and their public are struggling to cope with what is an epic embarrassment for the Kremlin. What's more, Ukrainian officials appear to be enjoying the proceedings, even ironically echoing lines used by the Kremlin itself back in 2014 when little green men invaded Crimea and then bust. Locals appeared in the Donbass. Russian state-controlled news media covered the border incursion and the official denial of involvement by Kyiv with visible emotion and frustration. Olga Skabayeva, a senior Kremlin propagandist and television moderator during a Tuesday evening broadcast of the top-rated Vesti News talk show, attacked Ukrainian national leadership's denial of involvement in the cross-border raid, describing it as lying, and you, Russian television viewers, must agree, absolutely cowardly, she added. They, senior Ukrainian officials, are saying that the tanks and weapons used in the attack were probably bought in military surplus stores and that they had nothing to do with it. A few hours previously, in viral Telegram comments, Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, used the same narrative of non-involvement and local armed groups rising up against a hostile state that the Kremlin pushed through its propaganda outlets during Moscow's 2014 invasion. Ukraine is watching the events in the Belgorod region of Russia with interest and is studying the situation, but it has no direct relation to it. As you know, tanks are sold at any Russian military surplus store, and underground guerrilla groups still consist of Russian citizens, Podolyak said. In a totalitarian country whose only political tool is repression, a partisan movement with weapons in hand is inevitable. Ukraine is watching the events in the Belgorod region of Russia with interest and studying the situation. However, it has no direct relationship with it. Podolyak's choice of language regarding the source of heavy weapons used in the Monday Belgorod cross-border raid military surplus store were identical to justifications offered by Russian state media outlets led by Skabayeva herself that the men armed with tanks, artillery, and armored personnel carriers attacking Ukrainian troops and taking over Ukrainian towns and villages adjacent to Russia were Ukrainian citizens who had armed themselves privately without any Moscow support. The main news website of the Ukrainian military on Tuesday commented on Skabayeva's anger at Podolyak's narrative. What goes around, comes around, comes around. Russian citizens on social media were just as incensed at the news coming out of Belgorod, using far more colorful language to express their fury. It's high time Kyiv was turned into a fucking ruin, said one. I don't know what they're waiting for. Strangle the scum in its nest. There was widespread anger at those who were supposed to defend Belgorod, with some people accusing Russian forces there of fleeing instead of fighting. Did we just give them, Russian Volunteer Corps, an armored vehicle? There were no casualties among our border guards, only one prisoner, asked one person. There were also calls for punishment for those who allowed the situation to happen. We will know the results from the investigation. Then we will say who should be punished for this, wrote one person. Predictably, there was also blame placed on the U.S. for some reason. Nothing has changed, and the U.S. has remained a threatening hegemon, one person wrote. It was not Ukraine that attacked Russia. It was the USA that forced Ukraine to give up Russia. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, authorities were trying to put a brave and calm face on events. What happened yesterday is a cause for deep concern, and once again confirms that Ukrainian militants continue their activities against our country. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters, "This requires more effort from us, and these efforts continue. The special military operation is continuing so that this does not happen again," he added, using the Kremlin's term for Moscow's war in Ukraine. Elsewhere on Monday, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence directorate, Kirill Budanov, had a far more serious message for Russian soldiers. In a recorded address, he said, "You have a choice. Die or save your life." Die or save your life. Budanov referred them to the state project called I Want to Live, a call in service that explains to RF soldiers how to surrender. It will get worse. Ukraine's military intel chief tells Russians. In the midst of a media frenzy over a foray by anti-Putin Russians into Russian Federation territory, Kryly Budanov calls on Russian soldiers to surrender. As news outlets rush to catch up with social media in covering the spate of reports about an incursion into the Russia Federation's RF Belgorod Oblast, Kryly Budanov, the head of Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, HER, released an address to Russian soldiers in Russian. You have a choice. Die or save your life, Budanov told the Russian soldiers, referring them to the state project called I Want to Live, a call in service that explains to RF soldiers how to surrender. If Budanov's past experience with PSYOPs is any indication, the two events might be related. The HER chief has been a thorn in the side of Moscow, which has tried him in absentia for terrorism since 2016, when he allegedly led a commando raid in occupied Crimea. Since then, he has escaped assassination attempts on more than one occasion. For weeks now, Russian analysts have been predicting a Ukrainian strike into the Belgorod Oblast. Among these analysts are Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the mercenary group Wagner, and arch-nationalist Igor Strelkov, who is a former Russian military intelligence officer responsible in large part for Russia's 2014 incursions into Crimea and the Donbass. Even the leaked Discord Pentagon documents allege that President Volodymyr Zelensky had discussed the possibility of occupying villages in the Russian Federation to use as leverage in any future negotiations. The May 22 incursion by what Russia's Belgorod Oblast governor Vyacheslav Gladkov described as a sabotage and reconnaissance group of the Ukrainian armed forces has generated so much media attention so quickly that many analysts are beginning to suspect either a diversionary attack or merely an elaborate PSYOPs ploy. Simultaneously, the Svoboda Rossiya, Liberty of Russia, Legion, a group of anti-Putin Russians fighting alongside the Ukrainians, published a call to their fellow citizens to rebel against the Kremlin dictatorship. In an interview with ABC News earlier this year, Budanov coyly said that he's very glad to see attacks on Russian territory, even though he cannot claim responsibility. When asked if he expected more attacks deep inside Russia, the HER chief responded, "Deeper and deeper. Putin's army is running on empty." The cost in lives on the Russian side of the equation is unprecedented, and yet Putin and his generals continue to feed Russian soldiers into the Ukrainian meat grinder. As the war in Ukraine approaches its 15th month, Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation is set to surpass yet another ominous milestone by the end of the week. 190,000 Russian soldiers killed in action. According to the Ukraine's defense ministry, as of April 28, the number of dead Russian soldiers is 189,460. The total number of Putin's soldiers killed in action will soon equal the total number of Russian troops committed in the initial full-scale invasion of Ukraine on Feb 24, 2022, 190,000. And to think, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley gave the Ukraine army less than 72 hours. It took just 15 months for the Russian death toll to equal the number of forces they committed to the initial invasion. By comparison, over the course of 21 years, the United States lost 58,220 Americans in the Vietnam War between June 1954 and April 1975. Russia, in contrast, only saw 14,500 soldiers die in Afghanistan between December 1979 to February 1989. That number is 1190 less than the official death count released by the Soviet Union in 1988 of 13,310. When you take into consideration the ratio of wounded soldiers to those killed in action, historically around 3:1, then another 568,380 Russian soldiers, at a minimum, have been wounded in action. That number starkly explains the partial mobilization in September 2022 and subsequent mobilizations since, upwards of 500,000. The cost in lives on the Russian side of the equation is unprecedented, and yet Putin and his generals continue to feed Russian soldiers into the Ukrainian meat grinder. In the Donetsk region area alone, over 80,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since Jan. 1. Why Donetsk, and especially why Bakhmut, since the small salt mining town is of little strategic significance? According to Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's head of military intelligence, this is the only place where they have had some tactical success despite huge losses. And against the background of the lack of success elsewhere, they face the problem that even their deceived society needs to show something, some kind of victory. This is the only place where they can do something. Budanov went on to add that Wagner Group founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, once said he would take Bakhmut, making it essential, at least from the Kremlin's point of view, that the Russian army capture the town. The growing animosity between the two groups contributed to an exchange of gunfire between Wagner Group forces and the Russian military in the Luhansk Oblast on April 23. The sheer number of Russian losses is numbing, but the loss in military experience and training are irreplaceable in the short term. As it is, the Russian military has never been known for having a strong, non-commissioned officer corps, the backbone of any army, or an adequate training regime to incorporate new soldiers into the ranks. Replacing casualties with fresh bodies in the form of mobilized reservists or conscripts does not reconstitute these once elite formations. The Spetsnaz, Russian airborne forces, Воздушно Desantny Войска России, Воздушно Desantny Войска России, VDV, and naval infantry. One such unit, the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, has been reconstituted on multiple occasions after battlefield defeats in Kiev, Bucha, Irpin, Pavlivka, and is now best known for its dismal performance in Vuhledar in February. The conventional Russian military is running on empty and awaiting the inevitable, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Defensive positions have been prepared and trenches are being filled with the next round of replacements. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Putin's brain trust hides behind threats of nuclear escalation and propagandist excuses, while general officers stay clear of open windows. When the offensive begins, 190,000 will rapidly transition to 200,000. Now, more than ever, is the propitious time for the Biden administration to fully commit to Ukraine and bring a decisive end to this war. To win, that means providing President Volodymyr Zelensky and his generals the combined arms capability they need, precision deep strike capability afforded by ATACMS and F-16s to expel Russian ground forces from all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. Reports that Ukraine refrained from launching deep strikes into Russia on the anniversary of the invasion because the White House had long worried that attacks inside Russia could provoke an aggressive response from the Kremlin, reinforces the perception held by many that the Biden administration is afraid to win or afraid of what could happen if the counteroffensive falls short. One thing is for sure, though, you will never know if you do not take the shot. And sadly, the Biden administration is content to hold the ball and let the clock run out. Indecision is a decision. Putin's army in Ukraine is running on empty, and the Biden administration is needlessly giving them time to reconstitute their forces and prepare defensive fortifications. Fear of winning should have no place in American thinking. Infuriatingly, however, it is becoming all too indicative of the Biden administration's approach to managing the war in Ukraine. While Putin is running on empty troop, wise President Joe Biden and his national security advisors appear to be running on empty when it comes to closing out Putin and his generals.